Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Dorothy Dalton. I'll tell you all about Dorothy in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that poses questions to thought leaders and doers like Dorothy. And we talk about what's often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others to bring people together for common cause. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dorothy Dalton. Welcome.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Dorothy is joining us from Belgium. She is a native of the UK, but she's lived for many, many years in Europe. So she's an international talent management strategist. She's the founder of a company called 3Plus. She supports organizations which understand a connection between business success, gender balance, diversity, and inclusion. So her current projects are about bias-based management and promotion systems. In other words, how to create equity in the workplace. So she has been involved in anti-bullying and harassment in the workplace, as a way to combat it, not provoking it. And she designs programs which address these issues. She's a certified coach and facilitator and keynote speaker who speaks everywhere, at least prior to COVID. Welcome, Dorothy Dalton. It's a pleasure to have you. So
thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Well, the reason you're here is I've known your work for a long, long time, but you wrote, well, I'm going to call it a seminal article just the other day, last week, in LinkedIn, and it was about the Great Resignation. So, and we had talked about this before. So what is the Great Resignation from your perspective, Dorothy?
Well, I think it's something that originated in the US, and research from Microsoft said that 41% of US employees were thinking of either handing their notice or quitting, or physically quitting with no jobs to go to. So you've had a lot of what we call the YOLO movement. So you only have live once. So basically to seize the day. We're not having that to the same extent in Europe. I think that we're having what I would call the Great Resignation thought. So people are definitely thinking about it, but they're not actually putting into practice as much as they are in the UK, in the US. I think the UK, they have, I think, 1 million openings at the moment. There's some research to say that in Germany that there's some discontent and movement, but generally that people are open to a move, but they're not actually giving up their jobs and taking the chance.
Right. Well, that's great. So you quote a McKinsey report that says that employers just don't understand. That almost reminds me of our youth, Dorothy. I'm sure I'm way older than you, but when what we call the generation gap, parents don't understand. So what the heck's going on?
I mean, I'm sure you're not a lot older than me. I think that's true. I mean, I think it's not just the McKinsey report. There's lots of research to suggest that executives are not in touch with what's going on for their teams. And it's around recognition, it's around belonging, it's around all of these things. And I'll give you a very practical example. I ran a session with 2 sessions, one with the leadership team, one with the managers. And it was obvious that the leadership had no idea what was going on for the managers. So it's around proximity with confinement. We're not having those same conversations that we used to. It's about time. Everyone's under pressure, but it's also a certain extent avoiding the difficult conversations too.
Right. Better just to not talk about it. So, I mean, look, senior executives are not stupid. They must sense what. So, what are the kind of factors that employees on the ground are saying? What do you hear, Dorothy? So,
I think they're looking for all the things like recognition. They want flexibility. They want autonomy. They want. I mean, in some instances, they want higher pay, but it's not always about that. Right. And executive think it's about work-life balance, it's about meaningful work, it's about all of those things. So that there is just a slight disconnect on the recognition and value and belonging piece, which they're not getting right at all.
Right. So you call there's something that a term, implementation gap. What does that mean, and what is it in reference to? So.
Well, that's just my own phrase, actually. It's
well, you own it. It's a good one. So give it a good meaning.
It's basically that people put up a good talk, right? I mean, you see this. It's not just me. So they're making these big public statements, but they're not getting it done. And there is a massive research to suggest that there was something came out from Smart Recruiters, diversity and inclusion budgets haven't increased for 10 years. We're not, for example, what's happening with women in the pandemic, they're leaving the workplace in droves. I saw a really, really great stat on Twitter today, because as you know, I'm a bit of a Twitter addict, that the number of chairpersons of boards has gone up by 1% from 98 to 97%. Is that right? Anyway, yeah. It's 1%. So they're basically all male, except for 3%.
Right.
So I think we're just not moving fast enough.
One of the reasons in the States, certainly, that women have left the workforce is the cost of childcare. Is that an issue in Europe? My sense is that it's a different dynamic there. So.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I hate to say this, but when you look at the data, but I'm always shocked when I see it that the US, for probably the richest economy in the world, or one of the richest economies, in terms of childcare and parental leave, I mean, I think apart from a few like Pacific Islands, there's nobody in worse shape than you. So yeah. I think it's something that it puzzles us, I think, in Europe, that we don't understand why this isn't happening. But it's true that you have some quite significant challenges around provision of childcare, which we have in certain places in Europe, but not to the same extent.
Right. Well, to clarify, and the audience here knows this, there is childcare. It's just very expensive.
Very expensive,
so
yeah.
That's the challenge. And so you have because you have spent your time and part of your career in recruitment. So you have a term, inclusive recruitment. What does that mean, Dorothy? So.
Well, for me, inclusive recruitment means extending the reach of your recruitment process to making it more diverse and bringing in a wider range of groups so that you touch more people. You get a diverse candidate pool, because the tendency is to basically get more what I call people like us, so mini-me recruitment. And so when it's male, when it's white, when it's male, when it goes to a certain school, when you've got a certain background, then it tends to be cloning in whatever country you're in.
I'm glad you used that term, because that's something I like that. And then it's sad. I mean, I'm not trying. A colleague of mine, Elena Love, who has done work in this area, and she talked about when we build for diversity and building from the ground up. And she uses a term, and I don't know if it's unique to her, but seeding. In other words, creating opportunities for people different from ourselves from a young age. And wherever your facilities are in the schools and things like that, look for people, because so often we will hear executives say, well, when pinpointed about lack of diversity or inclusion, or not inclusion, but diversity, they'll say, well, we can't find them. So when you hear that, what's your response?
That you just saw it. I mean, I use the expression "fish where there are fish," and so one of the things that we have in Europe is everybody wants to hire engineers and tech people, and so what they do is they focus on all the business schools and all the technical engineering universities or colleges that source them. But basically, what you have is every employer on the landscape fishing in the same pond. So it's about extending that. It's about, as your colleague said, extending the reach, going into schools, starting programs, starting internships from a very young age, doing little, I use the term boot camp, I'm not a fan of that phrase, but little camps where kids and young people learn to do the things, the skills that you need, developing relationships and partnerships in different places to the ones you normally go to. So not, if you like, the top end business school, for example.
What are some of the policies that work when it comes to inclusive recruitment? I think partly you mentioned that there, but do you have any other things, Dorothy, you want to add? So.
It's really complex, and it's really challenging, and it involves change, and involves change of everyone in the process. And none of us like to change, right? We don't. So it means we have to develop self-awareness, understand our own biases. Nobody likes to do that, right? It means that we have to bring in diverse recruitment teams. We have to rewrite our profiles. We have to develop partnerships in different areas. We have to be willing to take people on for their potential and what I call teachability. So instead of, having a job profile with 20 points and they're all mandatory, just reduce them to the bare minimum and say, okay, what can we teach? Because to your point in the introduction, if you look at the World Economic Forum, the skills for 2030 or even 2025, actually, most of them, I think all but 2 are soft skills. So if you've got a few hard skills that are lacking, whether it's language, whether it's a tech skill, bring in your learning and development people to your TA team and develop those people. So bring them in for potential and train them.
Now, I'm going to ask you maybe a sideways question. And we were talking about change as it applies to recruitment and things like that. Who's responsible for recruitment? I mean, we know the titles, but if we're talking change, should it be a more widespread effort throughout an organization? Do you have any feeling on that, Dorothy?
Yeah, I think that I don't have to tell you this. I mean, there are 3 pillars of workplace cultural change. So leadership commitment, then you've got the systemic change, and you've got individual behavior. And basically you can't, if you don't have those 3 pillars operating, then it won't work. So you have to have leaders that are committed, walk the talk, make it happen. You have to invest and have systems that are modified. And then everybody has to change the way they look at things. And because there's a great line, which inclusion starts with I. So it's all about our individual behavior. So everyone plays a part.
Now, you say something, and I've heard this before, and I certainly know from the consumer perspective. What does an employer's brand have to do with recruitment? Is it sizzle and appeal, or what are you finding, Dorothy? So,
I think there's research to say that candidates, before they engage with in the application process, have had between 7 and 15 what we call touch points. So they might have a bank account in your bank. They might have an insurance policy. They might walk past your building. They might follow you on social media. They might know someone who works there in your organization. So basically that your brand is out there all the time. So it's about showing your values, showing what you stand for, and having a positive message for the demographics that you want to target. So, for example, if you want to target women, because that's an area that I'm particularly interested in, then that you're not going to have all male images on your website, or post on social media a crowd of the guys in the pub after work or whatever. So it's about the way you show that you are there and presenting yourself for the demographics that you want to target. And it's just little things. I'll just give you for instance. I went into a building last week, and there was no easy access for someone who was disabled. So if I had a physical disability, then it's just things like that. People want to be able to access their place of work with dignity.
Great. And I think that leads to my next question, because you talk about something called, and you had touched on this before, diversity in recruitment or in training. So one can understand that gender and maybe ethnicity, but are there other things to be focused on when we talk about diversity in recruitment? So recruitment team, excuse me. So
diversity in the recruitment team. I think basically you want diversity of thought. So if you are just fielding the same old team of regular faces that have the same old judgments and views, what you want to do is you want to mix it up. So you need different ages, different race, ethnicity. You want different gender, different sexual orientation. All of these things that, or even neurodiversity, different types of neurodiversity, all of which bring a different perspective and have an input onto the hiring decision.
No, I'm glad you talked about neurodiversity, because that's an issue that's been more and more awareness here in the States, and so it can be a real powerful and competitive edge for employers who reach out and tap into it. So there's something that you talked about, and you already said it's uncomfortable, but it's bias. So when someone, I don't know if you ever hear, but they'll say, "Well, Dorothy, I'm really not biased." What do you say?
I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And I've run trainings on this. I've almost been lynched. I think that, one of the things that we have to take the discomfort out. And it's something I feel really strongly about. If you have a brain, you have a bias. Mm-hmm. One of the things we have to do is normalize it. So it's okay to have biases, that they quite often serve us well, but they do interfere with effective decision making. So what we have to do is not to try and fix the people, because that's what we've tried to do historically. There's something wrong with you, you're biased. It's not, we have biases, we have to learn to manage them. So that is my focus. And I think there's a lovely stat, is that only one person out of 661 people thinks they are more biased than their peers. So it's what we call blind spot bias. Right. So we think everyone's biased except us.
Well, let's see where it rubs, because people will, due to their background or actually lack of experience with people different from themselves, they will develop biases. And so they may think people who come from a different culture or a different racial background are not quite up to snuff. So that seems like a bias which is pretty harmful. So how do we just deal with that, or what's your perspective? So.
Well, there's prejudice and discrimination, there's bias, right? Yeah. So there are certain categories that are protected, but then there are certain unconscious biases that creep into our everyday decision making. And, you hear it particularly around age. That's the big bias, right? Is age. You hear it around gender, you hear it about sexual orientation, all of these things. One of the things is that bias is not always hostile. We quite often see it in banter, and people cracking jokes about women parking, or going to Thanksgiving dinners with people who give unsolicited advice from like paper CV area, that sort of thing. So I think we just have to make sure that we check in with ourselves and say, is that a bias? But also it's about creating a culture where we allow that to be called out, where it's not an area of conflict. It's, hey, is that a bias? Is that, so it's not an accusation. It's just what's called a nudge.
Right. Okay,
just good. Interestingly, just to share something, when I've done the Harvard implicit bias test, which I recommend everyone who listens to this do, that I exhibit some gender bias, which is astonishing, but I do. So, and it's about the way I was raised. So it's really important that we understand ourselves.
I'm glad you called yourself out. Thank you for your candor. But I think what's important is that you who work in this field, yes, you even have some biases, and I'm glad you did. And something about bias, and I've written about this in our reality, is that it takes guts to look in the mirror and really confront it. So yeah, it's the way I've been feeling, and we've seen a lot of change recently. Over the last decade or so with same-sex marriage and things like that, certainly in the U.S. But now our last summer was horrific in terms of racial injustice here in the States. So there has been greater awareness, but these are not events per se. They're creating new realities to which we need to adapt. Would you agree with that? Dorothy?
Yeah, I mean, and certainly that what I've encountered is, people calling me out as a white woman, and having to understand the perception of people of color who perceive white women to be part of the problem and not part of the solution, and that as someone who grew up where we saw adverts. So this is pre-equal opportunity, with adverts just men only. So for me, that's quite hard to get my head around, but it's something that I have to do to understand someone else's perspective.
Right. Curiously, we were talking about diversity in recruitment, and you raised something which is interesting, and it's probably going to become even more prevalent as we go forward, and that's AI, artificial intelligence. How is that working in recruitment?
I think I find it fascinating, and I'm not an expert, so I'm probably not the best person to dig deep in this. But basically, I think it can be enormously helpful. I think you've got opportunities to have blind CVs, you've got one-way interviews, you've got certain types of testing. But the other thing that I'm beginning to understand, there is bias within AI. So
all those algorithms,
So I mean, and this is way beyond me now.
Sure.
But I think that one of the things that we're going to need to do is get where we have to have AI audits for bias. And I'll just give you something that I came across. Was research out of Germany, where they found that when someone had a bookcase behind them, the perception of the interviewers was that the person was more intelligent. So obviously I tell all my clients, my coaching clients, if you're going to use a virtual background, put up a bookcase.
Right.
So it's just things like that we have to pay attention to.
Right. Now, you used the word earlier, but I think it's important and you when it comes to recruitment or teachability, what does that mean specifically in the area of recruitment?
I touched on this earlier. It's hiring managers tend to have this wish list of, and I've even said this to them, like, come on, your receptionist doesn't need an MBA. They have this like massive shopping list of skills that they need, like 10 years experience, 10 years. Someone can get the same level of experience in 1 year as someone can get in 10. So it's about switching it's just switching your assessment to being skill-based and competence. And a lot of hiring managers are reluctant to let go of that. And I think particularly when it comes to higher education. So if you've got someone with a Harvard background, or they've been to a top French and business school, then there is a tendency to think they're going to be better professionally. But there's a lot of research to say that that is not necessarily the case. So we do have to open up to that.
Germane to that, there's a saying, and you are far more familiar than I am, but don't hire for what you need today, hire for what you need tomorrow. Does teachability play into that, Dorothy?
Yeah, I mean, it does, but most people don't want that. Most people, you see ads, we want someone to, hit the ground running, fast-paced, dynamic, all of this sort of thing. And they don't do that. So teachability is getting some of those skills and allowing people to train. And you've probably noticed this as well, but I noticed in the recession of 2007, 2008, where a lot of managers were let go, and then a new cohort came through, and are now managers, but they've had no training. So we actually have this whole cohort of managers, and a lot of them are not trained. So I don't know if you've observed that.
No, I haven't. That's. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's just that in my small experience, that I haven't noticed it. So I know people are promoted into management all the time without any background. It's just, hey, Dorothy, you're doing a good job. By the way, you're going to manage this department tomorrow. That happens frequently. So.
Yeah. So you have a lot of people without necessarily having the skills to identify transferable and teachable assets or competences. Okay. So I think we do need to look at how we're doing things.
Right. The other side of, of recruitment is retention. So, what advice do you? So what do you have any insights into the retention as it applies to what we've been talking about?
I just wrote a post today for LinkedIn. It was called "Love the One You're With," and my question is, whoever says the great stay. We haven't heard the great stay, have we?
I like that term. Oh yeah.
So I think it's really. You've got a lot of people who are left behind. You've got a lot of people who are leaving. And it's time for organizations to pay attention to the people that are holding the fort. And a lot of the people holding the fort are women. And there is research come out of Qualtrics, which came out yesterday, I think, which is just saying that the demographic that organizations have to watch for, and this is the group that's ready to head out the door, are women leaders.
They're ready to head out the door.
Out the door, because they're undervalued, they're underappreciated, they're carrying the invisible workload in the office and at home, and their burnout levels are really high.
Right. So we are racing through this, and we've had a rich conversation. I like to ask every guest I have a story about grace, and I know you have something you'd like to share, Dorothy. So take it away. So.
Well, I did have to think about this, and this actually isn't pandemic induced, because I would have to categorize myself as one of the most mindless people I know. That I'm always thinking about what I'm going to do next, not what I'm doing. So in the really hard lockdown, I don't know if you had it in the US, but I mean, we weren't allowed to drive anywhere. We could only walk. So I embedded a walking habit. And I'm not a natural walker because it takes too long. But I really started to embed a walking habit, and I've got beautiful forests near where I live, and I've got a Zen bench, which I sort of go and sit and reflect. And I just find it something that gives me peace. And I find that if something bugs me, if I go on a walk, I can just go take a walk, sit on my bench, feel the power of the pause, and reframe what's been going on.
What a great story. I like how you framed the crisis, the challenge we're all facing and with COVID, and how you turned it into a positive for yourself. And you talk about the pause and that takes discipline. So kudos to you for recognizing, hey, I need to do this, and then do it. And I guess that's a wonderful way of channeling adversity into make it work for me. And so that's great. So, Dorothy, you've been a wonderful guest. How can people find you? So,
well, you can find me on LinkedIn. Dorothy Dalton, you will find me. My 3+ website is www.3plusinternational.com. And I'm a bit of a Twitter addict, and you can always find me on Twitter at Dorothy Dalton.
Great. We will put that in the notes. So thank you, Dorothy. You've been a wonderful guest, and thanks for spending time with us. And with that, we'll close out.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.